The chamber had been roaring with interruptions only moments before, a hive of smug laughter and pointed barbs bouncing from bench to bench. Yet when Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through, the room froze. She had risen, unyielding, her words, sharp enough to slice through layers of condescension laid at her feet. She did not shout, she did not tremble. She spoke like someone who had stared down ridicule so many times she no longer bent beneath its weight. In the final beat of her rebuttal, her gaze lingered across the benches, her words still vibrating in the air like a struck bell. Staffers glanced upward. Opponents averted their eyes. The courtroom was suspended in a silence far heavier than noise, the kind where even a cough felt like betrayal. In that silence, you could hear the echo of justice rarely spoken aloud. And then, the unthinkable happened. Chief Justice John Roberts, composed, famously restrained, a man known for his discipline in moments of high drama, leaned forward ever so slightly, his hands pressed against the table. His eyes did not dart like those belonging to men, caught off guard. They steadied, almost deliberate. The room collectively inhaled as his lips parted. For a heartbeat, even the cameras seemed hesitant, sensing something extraordinary was about to break through. His voice, calm yet unmistakable, carried across the silence. Though he offered no grand speech, no lengthy ruling, the weight sat. In the gesture itself, the subtle nod, the acknowledgement that she was not just audible but undeniable. For Jasmine Crockett, it was more than agreement. It was validation inside a court where women like her were more often challenged than championed. The silence deepened after his acknowledgement, no longer awkward but reverent. Respect, real and visible, flooded the chamber. It wasn't just Crockett's fire that lingered now. It was Roberts's recognition, a ripple that made even her fiercest critics shift uncomfortably in their seats. But to truly grasp why this quiet gesture sent shockwaves through America, we need to step back into the conflict that built this stage. Long before the silence that reshaped the room, the hearing had been a cauldron of hostility. The stakes were obvious from the first gavel strike. This wasn't a minor procedural session. Cameras were lined up shoulder to shoulder, reporters crammed against the back wall, live streams broadcast across millions of screens. It was the kind of hearing designed for theater, a place where some came not to seek clarity, but spectacle. From the moment Jasmine Crockett entered the courtroom, the traps were already visible. Opposing members leaned back in their seats, with thin smiles, whispering to aides, rehearsing questions not for answers, but for derision. These figures had built reputations on disruption and ridicule, and tonight's stage felt perfectly built for cheap shots. The strategy was simple. Portray Crockett as a hot-headed newcomer, incapable of handling serious debate. They wanted to brand her passion as instability, her conviction as arrogance, and they wasted no time. Questions came fast, each crafted, less like queries and more like daggers. Assertions dripped with condescension. Do you even understand the legal precedent at play here? Perhaps you need a reminder that this isn't a neighborhood rally, it's the Supreme Court. Every barb carried an undercurrent coated with dismissal, the implication that Crockett's very presence was the mistake. The audience could, feel it. Viewers on the livestream watched in real time as the antagonists smirked between each question, clearly baiting her, hoping to catch a flash of anger, a stumble, anything that could be replayed and circulated online as proof that she was out of her depth. They had done it before to others. They thought this hearing would be no different. But Jasmine Crockett sat upright, her posture a refusal to yield. She listened, pen tapping against her notes, her eyes sharp and steady. Every trap they laid seemed to evaporate in the heat of her composure. She did not interrupt. She did not flinch. Her restraint bred something dangerous for her opponents: anticipation. Meanwhile, the stakes expanded far beyond the walls of the chamber. Because this was not simply about Crockett proving her competence, it was about the narratives that shape who gets to be heard in America. Women of color in positions of power are too often drowned in caricatures, boxed into stereotypes before they can even complete their sentences. And the architects of tonight's ambush wanted to write Crockett into that same old script. But those watching from living rooms, classrooms, phone screens during midnight doom scrolling saw something different. They saw the setup. They saw the sneers. They recognized what it meant to walk into a room where the rules were stacked against you, where the expectation was not victory but humiliation. And in that recognition, anger began to build, not from Crockett, but within the audience itself. The tension only tightened as one antagonist leaned in with a mocking grin. "Ms. Crockett, maybe you're confused. This chamber isn't for fiery speeches. It's for serious people dealing with serious law." The insult lingered, cheap and deliberate. A smattering of chuckles rolled across the conservative side of the room. They waited for her to snap, to break, to give them the clip they craved. But she didn't. In that moment, watching her refuse the bait, you could feel the stakes shift. What was supposed to be her unraveling began to look more like her proving ground. Every word of derision made the anticipation heavier. Every question sharpened the suspense. When she finally responded, how devastating would it be? Because what no one outside her circle seemed to understand was this: Jasmine Crockett had prepared her entire career for this kind of stage. Every racist undertone she'd faced, every underestimation she had long outwitted as a lawyer, every cheap attempt to put her in her place, all of it had been training for this very fire. Everyone thought this would be another takedown of a rising voice. They had no idea who they were up against. To understand the collision that would electrify the chamber, you have to step into the minds of those who believed they had the upper hand. These weren't faceless bureaucrats fumbling through procedure. No, they were seasoned performers in the theater of contempt. Politicians who had built their brands on cheap mockery, viral sneers, and the art of condescension. Their plan was as old as it was cynical. Turn a hearing into a stage, turn their victim into a punchline. From the second Jasmine Crockett's name was placed on the roster, the whispers began. Antagonists, armed with smug confidence, exchanged knowing glances, ready to make an example out of her. They weren't here to discuss law or precedent. They were here for the spectacle. And for them, Crockett was an irresistible target. A younger, black woman, sharp, unapologetically outspoken, representing precisely the America they wished to caricature, dismiss, and intimidate. Watch closely, and you could see their craft. The first tool in their arsenal was the eye roll. Dismissal, without words. Each time Crockett asked for clarification, each time she requested space to finish, the villainous side of the room tilted their heads exaggeratedly, brows raised in, "Here she goes again," disdain. It was a pantomime as old as the chamber itself, a learned performance of superiority. Then came the coded barbs. They knew better than to be overt, so they dipped their daggers in the honey of polite phrasing. Compliments laced with venom. "It's admirable you're so passionate." "Representative, but maybe you've mistaken passion for credibility." Remarks cloaked as instruction. "Perhaps once you've had more years in public service, you'll understand the gravity of this chamber." Every line was engineered to belittle, to shrink her stature in the eyes of the audience while inflating their own. The cynicism of it all was palpable. These antagonists thrived not on truth, but on clips. A smirk here, a jab there, chopped up into shareable content for their base. Proof they had owned a Democrat. Proof they had kept alive. The never-ending cycle of outrage. This wasn't oversight. It wasn't governance. It was branding. Their brand was derision. And tonight, Jasmine Crockett was supposed to be their unwilling prop. But beneath their arrogance rose a deeper insecurity. They knew voices like hers unsettled the balance. Crockett represented a generation unwilling to follow unwritten rules about deference and silence. To them, her composure itself was aggravating, because it challenged the caricature they counted on. She didn't play the role they'd written in their minds. She refused to legitimize their antics with outrage that could be spun back against her. Every calm glance was its own rejection of their theater. The audience watching outside could see the setup clearer than ever. People streaming on phones shook their heads at the pattern. They'd seen it too often, opponents pretending to be gatekeepers, measuring worthiness, wielding tone and gender and race like invisible weapons in the room. They thrived on microaggressions, testing how far they could push before appearing uncivil. These were the mechanics of the mockery machine. One antagonist in particular leaned heavily on arrogance. Between interruptions, he offered know-it-all lectures, addressing Crockett as if she were a student rather than a peer. His sentences dripped with theatrical sighs. Representative, maybe if you sit back and truly listen, you'll learn something today. The smirk at the end was deliberate, a smirk not for her, but for the cameras cataloging his contempt. For many in the audience who have stood in workplaces, classrooms, or meetings and endured the same smirk, the same eye roll, the same patient but patronizing tone, it was déjà vu. This wasn't just political warfare. It was cultural reenactment of every time someone tried to strip away dignity through mockery. That's what made the room's energy so combustible. It tapped into the universal ache of being underestimated on purpose. And yet, as they grew, bolder with every interruption, they missed the shift happening in real time. Crockett wasn't cracking. She wasn't sputtering into defensive justification. Each jab only layered more anticipation. She let silence hang where they wanted chaos. She let smirks float unanswered. That discipline, the poised refusal to validate their cynicism, was pulling the oxygen out of their strategy. But the villains didn't sense it yet. They believed the battle was theirs, that Crockett's dignity was fragile, and her resolve easily broken. They leaned in harder, banking on the myth that repetition of disrespect ensures victory. Smugness thickened in the room like smoke. They didn't know that beyond their sneers something larger was forming. An unshakable composure was coiling, waiting for the right moment to strike. The kind of composure you don't rehearse but earn through years of surviving storms designed to drown people like you out. And when that composure finally answered them back, the very tactics they counted on would soon crumble under a single, unshakable woman's composure. Before that hearing chamber ever became her battlefield, Jasmine Crockett had already lived a lifetime of fights on behalf of those left voiceless. Her story wasn't forged in marble hallways or cushioned in privilege. It was carved in courtrooms and communities where justice was too often rationed out like a commodity, and dignity had to be defended like oxygen. She began her path as a civil rights attorney in Dallas, where the cases she took weren't the glamorous type that win awards or headlines. They were cases few wanted to touch. Tenants facing eviction, young people trapped in a system that criminalized them before recognizing their humanity, families pushed to the margins under laws written without them in mind. Crockett walked head first into that storm because she understood it intimately. She had lived the reality of being doubted, dismissed, underestimated, and she carried that knowledge like armor. In those courtrooms, she wasn't just practicing law, she was practicing survival. It wasn't rare for judges or opposing counsel to underestimate her, sometimes even attempting to lecture her on statutes she knew chapter and verse. But she made a decision early. Their doubts would become her discipline. While others smirked, she filed motions meticulously. While others rolled their eyes, she dismantled arguments fact by fact. With every trial, she built a reputation. Crockett doesn't back down and she doesn't break. Her courtroom fire sharpened her political instincts because she realized the law wasn't just broken in neighborhoods. It was broken in the way policies were written, enforced, and manipulated by the powerful. When she ran for state office, and eventually for Congress, it wasn't a career move. It was an escalation of her fight. She couldn't just defend people case by case. She needed to challenge and write the very rules under which those cases arose. But Congress, like the courtroom, had its predators. Black women in politics are often policed not only for what they say, but for the tone with which they say it. Too assertive? Angry? Too calm? Uninterested? Too polished? Fake? Too passionate? Unhinged? The box was always shrinking, designed to suffocate. Crockett knew this trap intimately, and yet she walked into it armed with a reputation for plain speech and unapologetic fire. She refused to dim her voice to fit someone else's comfort zone. Those who followed her rise saw that fire as both her risk and her gift. She could light up a room with humor one moment and incinerate hypocrisy the next. What endeared her most To her progressive base wasn't just her policy votes, it was her willingness to confront political bullies head-on, to say the thing nobody else dared to say, and to say it with precision sharp enough to be irrefutable. But Crockett understood something deeper, too. Survival in those halls isn't just about speaking boldly, it's about enduring the long game. Her career had already been peppered with viral gotcha moments from opponents trying to reduce her to outbursts or out-of-context clips. She learned to meet those attempts with balance, never surrendering her intensity, but also never letting them script her downfall. That restraint was its own weapon, and so constituents who had long felt marginalized saw in Jasmine Crockett something life-affirming, a reflection of themselves standing unbowed in spaces that were never designed for them. Immigrant families, women of color balancing 10 forces at once, the young generation who had grown cynical about government, they watched her and thought, if she can stand there, maybe I can too. Her fire wasn't selfish ambition, it was inheritance on behalf of those who could not stand beside her physically, but were present in spirit each time she took the microphone. There's a certain beauty in that. Crockett's very presence was resistance, resistance against silence, against invisibility, against the tired expectation that she should be grateful simply to share the room. And that resistance had been tested not in one viral clash, but over years of showing up again and again, despite every barrier placed in her way. This is why, on that fateful day in the chamber, she could hold her composure so fiercely. To the outside observer, it might have looked like a single act of defiance. But for Crockett, it was muscle memory. She had already survived sharper insults, more subtle slights, more systemic dismissals. Her resilience wasn't improvised, it was rehearsed by necessity. That's what made her fire dangerous to the villains in the room. They weren't just facing a congresswoman. They were facing the culmination of years of lived struggle, honed into strategy, polished into eloquence, armored by scars. She knew that when she finally unleashed her response, it wouldn't simply be words spoken in a hearing. It would be rooted in every case she argued, every slight she endured, every person back home who had ever whispered, "Don't let them silence you." The drama of this hearing, then, wasn't just about procedural jousting. It was about legacy in the making. Villains thought she would play into caricature. Instead, she embodied something subtler and stronger, fearless dignity. For Jasmine Crockett, politics is not about survival of ego. It's about survival of truth. And if she seems unwilling to bend, it's because she knows bending would betray not just herself, but the generations of people whose stories she carries with her. She would need every ounce of that fire, because the moment of truth was coming. The hearing resumed with the sharp clang of a gavel, yet the air was anything but orderly. The chamber, already simmering, seemed to boil over as the antagonists renewed their assault. Their voices piled one on top of the other, calculated interruptions meant to drown Jasmine Crockett before her arguments could even breathe. Laughs punctuated questions that weren't questions at all, but traps. And every dismissive chuckle was aimed less at her reasoning and more at the idea that she even dared to stand her ground. "Representative, you seem a little confused." "About the case law here," one began, before his voice dissolved into a patronizing grin. Another chimed in. "Maybe Congress isn't the place for campaign-style theatrics." The words hung in the air, barbed reminders that they never intended to debate her in good faith. They wanted to rattle her. They wanted the flash of temper, the viral recoil, the satisfaction of claiming she had cracked. The laughter from their side of the chamber grew just loud enough to be provocative, just quiet enough to claim innocence. Eye rolls swept the benches. Staffers leaned into each other like it was a comedy show and not a pivotal hearing. Every smirk served as punctuation, rehearsed derision they could excerpt later as proof of keeping control. But across the battlefield, Crockett did not flinch. She inhaled slowly, fingers resting but not gripping her pen, her posture carved in stone. The interruptions stacked higher, but she sat through each one like a mountain staring down rain. The stillness was unnerving to watch, as though the silence itself was gathering momentum, a storm patiently deciding when to break. And then it did. Her microphone clicked on, small but certain, and the room's noise recoiled as though anticipating what was to come. Crockett's voice carried with disciplined clarity. No racing, no shout, just a deliberate rhythm that grew sharper with each word. She took the insults they had lobbed and turned them point by point into mirrors, reflecting their own hypocrisy back at them with such poise that their smirks began to falter. "You call credibility into question," she began, "yet ignore the precedent when it serves your narrative. You claim this chamber is reserved for the serious, yet you sit here mocking, interrupting, deflecting. Which of us is truly unfit for the gravity of this moment?" Her words sliced through the pretense. The chamber quieted. Each sentence landed like a hammer, leaving no space for their usual interruptions. Even those who had chuckled earlier found themselves staring down at their tables or scrambling through papers to appear busy. Crockett leaned in, her tone not rising but tightening, coiled with precision. "You didn't bring me here to listen. You brought me here to play the role you scripted for me. But I don't take cues from a mockery machine. I write my own record. And it will show exactly who respected the law in this chamber, and who disrespected it with theater." Every phrase was fuel for the audience watching outside those walls. The livestream comment sections spiked with fire emojis and exclamations. Watchers typed in disbelief that she had managed to remain so composed under such blatant contempt, only to unload truth so calmly lethal. By the end, her rebuttal bristled with energy so controlled it made her antagonists look amateurish in comparison. Their performance had backfired. Instead of baiting Crockett into a clip of reckless fire, they had curated a moment where her eloquence was undeniable. Their smirks collapsed into tight lips, their interruptions into silence they no longer trusted themselves to shatter. For a moment, the chamber hovered in stunned quiet, as though everyone was waiting for time itself to start again. Crockett had lit the room and the burn marks would remain long after the gavel fell. But the true shock wasn't her words alone. It was who responded to them. The shift was nearly imperceptible at first. A pause, a breath, a slight lowering of her shoulders. But everyone watching knew it marked the turning of the tide. Jasmine Crockett's microphone light blinked red, and with a voice steady as a metronome, she began her rebuttal. Gone was the reactive courtroom, the noise, the catcalling tone of antagonists trying to drown her. What emerged was control embodied. "Let me be clear," she said, each syllable deliberate, as though chiseling it into the marble lining of the chamber. Her voice did not waver, nor did it rise to match the interruptions and laughter that had piled on minutes earlier. Instead, she chose precision. She chose surgical calm. At first, some believed they were watching her stall. Momentary attempt to compose herself. Smirks spread across her opponents' faces, shoulders still raised in self-satisfaction. One antagonist leaned back in his chair as if already victorious, whispering to his neighbor. But Crockett had orchestrated this pace by design. She began dismantling their arguments layer by layer. When they mocked her understanding of precedent, she responded by citing chapter and verse of case law, laying out facts with the patience of a teacher correcting a student who hadn't studied. When they accused her of grandstanding, she countered with receipts, pointing out the exact procedural rules that dignified her points while exposing their repeated interruptions as violations of protocol. Every explanation grew tighter, faster, like steps on a drum beat. She built momentum deliberately, her delivery escalating not in volume but intensity, until her opponent's laughter began sliding off their lips into uneasy silence. "Gentlemen," she said, her tone calm but slicing, "when you ask if I understand the law, it reveals more about your assumptions than about my knowledge. And the assumptions don't expose me. They expose you." The word hung, bitterly sweet, searing. Staffers widened their eyes. A ripple moved through the audience, quick, sharp intakes of breath as though she'd struck a chord everyone had felt, but few had dared to articulate in that chamber. Her antagonists shifted in their seats. One shuffled papers suddenly, another tapped his pen, small gestures betraying unease. For the first time all night, they weren't in control of the script. Then Crockett moved into her final strike, a shift from defense to offense, flipping the narrative with precision so exact the antagonists had no safe footing left. "You "Claim this is not the place for fiery speeches," she said, locking eyes with one of her loudest detractors. "But I remind you, this chamber has never been a sanctuary of silence. It has been a forum of courage. Real courage doesn't mock. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't dress condescension up as law. Real courage stands, speaks truth, and lets the truth stand on its own legs." Her words cracked like thunder, but what made them devastating wasn't their force. It was their restraint. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't pounded the desk. And still the chamber vibrated. The opponents knew they had lost the oxygen. For men and women who thrived on spectacle, what Crockett had given them was worse than humiliation. It was irrelevance. Every sharp sneer, every sarcastic laugh had been buried under her surgical precision. She had lifted the mirror they intended to use against her and held it up, forcing their own theater to collapse inward. The room had transitioned. Allies who had once sat nervously glancing between Crockett and her detractors now leaned forward. In admiration, shaky smiles tugging at dignified lips. You could see heads nod subtly, staffers whispering, "She's crushing this," into the collars of their shirts. Even skeptics in the back rows, unaligned politically, had to admit the chamber had shifted, and then it happened. Chief Justice John Roberts, who had sat almost motionless throughout the night, finally broke the stillness he was so famous for. He had spent decades cultivating the persona of the careful umpire, rarely outwardly emotive, never telegraphing reactions. But Jasmine Crockett's rebuttal had cut through his reserve in a way no one expected. He leaned forward, not dramatically, but enough that every camera angle caught the shift. Fingers pressed against the table, his eyes steadied, as if weighing something heavy. The silence thickened as the chamber unconsciously followed his body language. And then, in a voice low, deliberate, and utterly devoid of theatrics, he spoke. "Representative Crockett is correct, on every point." 8 words. That was all, but they detonated like fireworks in the vaulted room. Gasps broke the silence, sharp, audible, from staffers and senators alike. Allies blinked in disbelief, then let the astonishment bloom into smiles. Even those who opposed Crockett knew what had just happened. Roberts had broken his own pattern of silence, siding unmistakably with her. It wasn't merely a validation of her facts. It was a validation of her. Look closely, and you could see one antagonist's smirk fall entirely, as though he'd swallowed something sour. His plan to portray her as the angry, unstable outsider had collapsed in the face of the Chief Justice's calm acknowledgement. Another opponent shifted violently in his chair, grinding his jaw, staring down at a stack of papers he no longer had the will to pretend to read. But Crockett didn't gloat. She didn't raise her chin or flash a triumphant smile. She simply sat back, collected, letting the Chief Justice's words stand like an unmovable monument behind her. Her entire rebuttal had been enough. The validation sealed it as historic. For those in the chamber and the millions watching, the image crystallized into memory. Crockett, sharp and composed, seated before the sneering antagonists she had just dismantled. Roberts, leaning forward with a solemn nod, her words reinforced, by the highest judicial authority in the land. What came next was a silence of a different kind. Not awkward, not mocking, but reverent. The villains had been silenced in a way words could not achieve, because Roberts's affirmation reverberated louder than any insult they dared sling. The chamber would never forget that silence, nor would the millions who watched clips that very night. But as dramatic as it felt in that moment, nobody could predict what was about to unfold beyond those walls, because history wasn't finished making its statement. Yet the story didn't end inside those walls. Outside, the internet was about to break wide open. It didn't take hours for the moment to spread. It took seconds. The clip of Jasmine Crockett's poised rebuttal, punctuated by Chief Justice John Roberts' sudden nod of validation, shot across the internet like a lightning strike. Phones buzzed with push notifications. Screens lit up in living rooms, offices, subways. By the time the gavel even closed the session, America was already replaying the scene again and again. Hashtags bloomed within minutes. Thus sofritas, Crockett was right trended across Twitter Gex for nearly 2 straight days, climbing above celebrity gossip and sports playoffs. Posters and activists seized on Roberts' gesture, the lean forward, the calm affirmation, as the unmistakable proof that Crockett had not only held her ground, but won over the ultimate skeptic. Clips in slow motion flooded timelines, captions screaming, "The room went silent." On TikTok, the moment morphed into a cultural phenomenon. Creators spliced the footage with dramatic soundtracks, violins swelling, bass drops syncing perfectly, with Roberts' simple phrase, "Representative Crockett is correct." Others turned it into memes, flashing between Crockett's stillness and her opponent's smirks crumbling into tight jaws. One viral remix dubbed it the respect moment, and soon users were parodying courtroom scenes across history, only to end with Crockett's steady gaze and Roberts' unexpected validation. YouTube reactors gave it their own spin. Progressive commentators leaned into the shock of Roberts' breaking character, calling it a pin drop heard around the country. Even apolitical creators, gamers, and lifestyle vloggers paused their own content to play the clip for their audiences, reacting wide-eyed, hands-on faces, whispering, "Did the Chief Justice really just do that?" Celebrities jumped into the fray. One actor posted the footage with the caption, "This is how history shifts, not with shouting, but with courage met by respect." A Grammy-winning musician shared it to her Instagram story, writing simply, "Say her name, Jasmine Crockett." Athletes posted it as motivation before games. Composure beats arrogance every time. It was no longer a hearing. It had become an anthem. But the reactions that resonated deepest weren't from the famous, but from the everyday. Black women across the country filled the comments and stitched their own videos with tears in their voices, describing what it felt like to see someone look like them, speak like them, stand where they never thought they'd be. And not only hold space but receive validation for it in real time. One woman summed it up simply, "For once, we weren't gaslit. For once, someone powerful said, 'You're right.'" Gen Z found in the moment a new shorthand for dignity. Memes labeled Crockett and Roberts together as the odd alliance and checks and balance, literally. In Discord servers and group chats, young voters dissected every line of Crockett's delivery as if it were a playbook. TikTok captioned it as a lesson. "This is how you handle disrespect and still win." The younger generation, cynical about politics, suddenly had a clip that felt both dramatic and instructional. Meanwhile, mainstream media had no choice but to amplify the wave. Morning Joe reran the footage 3 times in back-to-back segments. The View devoted an entire discussion to it. One host beamed, "She just rewrote the playbook for composure under fire." Podcasts churned out emergency episodes calling it "The Night the Mockery Machine Broke Down." Even conservative outlets struggled to spin. Attempts at damage control framed Roberts' nod as courtesy, but the video betrayed them. No one could watch it without seeing the weight of what had actually transpired. And so, the antagonists' plan collapsed beyond retrieval. They had hoped to bait Crockett into a viral clip of chaos. Instead, they had given her a viral clip of power. Their laughter, once timed for the cameras, faded into the B-roll of their own undoing. The ripple effects hardened into permanence. T-shirts emblazoned with "Crockett was right" appeared for sale online within days. Posters circulated in activist networks with the image of Crockett speaking mid-rebuttal, Roberts in the background leaning forward. Some protest marches even adopted it as a chant. Voice 1. Who was right? Crowd. Crockett was right. Memes had become mottos. A moment had become movement. But what made this digital earthquake unique wasn't just the speed of its spread or the creativity of its remixes. It was the sheer depth of its meaning. For once, dignity wasn't silenced. For once, composure wasn't ignored. For once, the narrative did not quickly turn back to caricature or spectacle. Instead, truth stood, and Roberts' validation forced it to stand taller. Yet the true resonance wasn't about views, shares, or hashtags. Beyond the memes and shares came something deeper, a reframing of who belongs in America's halls of power. When the echoes of laughter faded, when the last smirks had collapsed under the weight of silence, What remained in that chamber was not chaos, but dignity. Jasmine Crockett had not risen on a wave of anger. She had not resorted to the same shallow theater that was weaponized against her. Instead, she had commanded the moment by refusing to break. And that is where the deepest power resides, not in the noise but in the composure that outlasts it. Her presence in that courtroom served as proof that dignity disrupts far more effectively than derision. Crockett's rebuttal wasn't just, sharp rhetoric. It was a declaration that truth cannot be mocked out of existence. Her adversaries had come armed with interruptions and insults, yet she dismantled them with calm, surgical precision. She flipped the script by doing what they could not, respecting the very space they tried to turn into a circus. And then came Roberts. His gesture may have been small, but its impact reached seismic proportions. A Chief Justice who rarely leaned forward to make emotional affirmations chose that moment to validate her words. Roberts's nod and quiet conviction revealed something essential. Allies don't always arrive in the shape or voice we expect. They don't always roar or dominate. Sometimes, solidarity looks like a single line spoken at exactly the right moment, under circumstances where silence would otherwise reaffirm injustice. That is what made the exchange extraordinary. It punctured the narrative that dignity can be ignored, erased, or laughed away. Crockett's composure demanded recognition, and Roberts supplied it, not for partisan posturing, but because truth leaves no other option. And in that rare alignment, the nation saw what happens when courage meets validation. The noise is overcome, and the silence left behind is not empty. It's respect. Zoom out, and the lesson is strikingly universal. We live in a world addicted to spectacle, where volume is too often mistaken for influence. Yet Crockett reminded us that composure under pressure can command more attention than the loudest insult. We live in a culture where marginalized voices are too often left stranded, forced to carry battles alone. Yet Roberts reminded us that it takes so little, a nod, a word, an acknowledgement, to shift an entire narrative from dismissal to dignity. This was not about winning a debate, as though the night were part of a scoreboard. This was about reshaping what belonging looks like in the very halls designed to exclude. Crockett stood as herself, unapologetic, unshaken, unbroken, and refused to let the game play her into silence. Roberts showed that when those with unexpected power validate that resilience, the ripple effect can reach millions who had grown weary, convinced that their truth would never be recognized. For everyone who has ever been ignored in a room drowning, with noise for everyone who has ever been spoken over, underestimated, or caricatured, this moment was for you. Because in Crockett's defiance and Roberts' recognition, we were reminded that dignity is not a favor to be handed out. Dignity exists already. What changes history is when others finally choose to recognize it, and that is why the moment will echo long after the hashtags fade. It demonstrated that dignity disrupts. It disrupts arrogance, it disrupts injustice, it disrupts the temptation to believe that derision always wins. Crockett's fire and Roberts' quiet affirmation collided to create something larger than either one of them alone. A promise that the fight for justice, belonging, and respect is not won through loudness, but through persistence that refuses to be silenced. If you've ever felt unseen in a room full of noise, this moment was for you. And its lesson is clear. Your composure is not weakness, your persistence is not invisible, and when dignity disrupts, the noise can no longer hold. What unfolded in that chamber was never just a debate. It wasn't about quick points scored or political theater to be forgotten by morning. It was about something deeper, a declaration of belonging, a command for recognition, and the rare moment when undeniable truth received undeniable respect. Jasmine Crockett did not merely argue, she carved her place into the narrative with composure that defied ridicule, and Chief Justice Roberts, in his own understated way, sealed that moment with validation that no one in the room could ignore. That's what will be remembered. Not the barbs, not the chuckles, not the smirks of those who tried to diminish her. What history will hold on to is the fact that dignity showed up, and dignity was recognized. This was not partisan sparring. This was a statement. Belonging cannot be mocked out of existence, and truth cannot be smothered by arrogance. And here is where it matters for all of us. The responsibility doesn't end in that courtroom. Each of us walks into rooms that hum, with noise, boardrooms, classrooms, family dinners, community spaces, rooms where someone is being undermined, silenced, or overlooked. That is our cue. Be like Jasmine, clear, fearless, grounded in truth. Be like Roberts. When dignity rises, validate it out loud because others are watching. If you felt inspired tonight, don't let it stop here. Share this story. Subscribe for more. Hit like to keep spreading moments that remind us justice still has a voice. And in the comments, tell us, whose voice do you believe needs validation next? Because the fight doesn't pause with Crockett's victory. And trust me, you'll want to see what happened when another brave soul clapped back at Jim Jordan last week.